the Cannabis Business Coach.
Hi, Mike Z here, author of the Cannabis Business Book, and you're listening to the Cannabis Business Coach podcast, where I chat with and coach the highest performing entrepreneurs in the cannabis industry.
Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. The Cannabis Business Coach.
Hi, Mike Z here, and on today's episode of the Cannabis Business Coach podcast, I'm joined by Michael Krawitz, the Executive Director of Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. And I'm honored to have you here, Michael, because I know I'm going to learn a lot today because you've been doing this for a long time and you're a wealth of knowledge and you've been a diehard activist for many, many years. So thank you, first of all, for your service to our nation and also to the cannabis community. And so if you don't mind, would you please introduce yourself to the folks watching and listening and tell them who you are?
Great, man. Thanks, Mike. I'm Mike Krawitz. I'm a disabled U.S. Air Force vet. Served in so-called peacetime in the 1980s. And I am the executive director of Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. As you said, we're a national voluntary association, veteran service organization. Kind of unusual in the voluntary part because we don't have a checkbook. We don't have a formal IRS status. We work as a group of individuals collectively for our common mission.
Wow, amazing. And you also are involved in some other organizations doing some work beyond that. So can you tell us a little about that as well?
Sure. So it's a bunch, but the key ones are I'm on the board of the Origins Council. That's formerly the Mendocino Appellations Project. We're working on cannabis appellations out in California in the North Country, North Mountain, North Hills, North Mountains, California mountains, cannabis. Good California grown cannabis, trying to create that space and create that as a sort of a model for others to follow, to protect and to create space for traditional, very special to the place cannabis grown in a special way with special love, special practices by special people. And work with DRCNet Foundation, the Drug Reform Coordination Network, out of the other side of the country, out of DC. The main thing that we've been doing with DRCNet Foundation, Stop the Drug War, as it's also called, is work at the international level to bring attention to the awful murders that have been done under the color of law in the Philippines under the drug war there. And the DRCNet Foundation is also our sort of flagship at the UN. With accreditation. I can explain that a little more if you want, but you have to have a badge basically to get in the UN. You have to get invited to be inside, and to be inside, you have to get invited. To get invited, you have to be inside. Typical government catch-22. That was a big part of my early work, was to get those badges, and I'm really proud of the fact that we have so many, what's called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are able to work inside of the UN. So I'm part of now, with Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access, we've joined this thing called the Veterans Action Council. And that's made up of individuals and veteran service organization representatives and military veterans from all across the country and even all across the world, if they want to join with us at our sort of old school roundtable, like an oak roundtable in virtual space. And it's been really great for us to meet, under COVID. It's really been helpful. And we're sort of working on projects that collectively we can work on, that individually, even with a large service organization, individually would be difficult. So it's sort of finding that common ground that the military veterans are looking for in this space. It's mostly set up by veterans that are working in medical cannabis access, but it's actually had a larger scope. We've even worked on, hospital availability in the VA system, whatever comes up on our radar, we're working on. And internationally, we're working with, I'll mention just a couple more groups, at least 3, working with MAPS here in the United States, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They've also gotten their badges, and they've been working with us inside the UN, and working on the right to science and the right to do scientific studies. That's been a pet project ever since they've been working on cannabis research under the federal program, as you know. And then NCOD, based out of Austria, European NGO coordination network. And they also have accreditation at the UN and act as our local activists and bring in activists from all over the world working on coca, working on cannabis, working on the right to farm, a lot of different issues that cross over. And then finally, Fields of Green for All, our partner in South Africa, who also is in the process of getting accreditation at the UN. You can see we built sort of a team at the UN with the best that we could find from Earth and try to cobble them together. But that should be a good sampling to give you an idea of who we're working with.
Oh, that's amazing. So, Michael, let's take a step back for a second. I want to hear how or when or how, when, why did you get involved in the cannabis movement? What's kind of the origin story, if you will?
I got a bunch of different origin stories. The basic origin story is that I was in college and I was looking for a place to go on spring break. And this was back in the early mid to mid 90s, 1990s. And it turned out, just fluke of the crazy airfares that year or whatever it was, that it was cheaper to go to Amsterdam from Virginia than it was to go to Florida from Virginia. And I just, as a lark, looked that up. And when I found out it was actually true, it wasn't a lark anymore. It became a real thing. So we actually went over to Amsterdam. And while over there, I got to visit a coffee shop, use cannabis legally for the first time. It was really, interesting. It was different. And there was this little museum there that I saw. I didn't have time to even check it out, but I saw it was there. And then next time I came to Amsterdam, I checked it out and got to meet the folks behind it. Is Ben Dronkers, a Sensi Seeds Cannabis Hemp Museum in Amsterdam. And the curator for that museum, you might know him, a guy named Chris Conrad out of California. The Emperor Wears No Clothes editor, wrote his own book, Hemp Lifeline of the Future. And he actually was behind the counter. So I was asking, one of the key people of our generation that worked on, rebirth of the information of hemp and cannabis that created the movement, essentially. I was asking him for information personally. I didn't realize how perfect a source I had found myself with. And that led me to two other things in Amsterdam. It was the Green Prisoners Release Project, which was mostly set up to try to stop the extradition of US expats that were hiding out in Amsterdam because they faced massive penalties back in the United States for growing marijuana. Les and Cheryl Mooring were facing like 100 years in Missouri for growing like 100 plants. And what the Green Prisoners Amsterdam did, check this out, they took the same number of plants, seedlings, live in a tray, and carried them with no box or anything, just in an open tray on the train to The Hague, to show the government and say, this is what these people are facing life in prison for. What I have in my hand right here, this is what they're facing life in prison. Are you really going to send them back to the US? So stuff like that really got me started. It actually was years later, it was around 1997, that I was fixing to get to go to this big drug summit. And I really started working on this international stuff more. I made a pilgrimage out to Oregon and met up with Jack Herer, Dennis Perone, all those guys. And I actually thought, when I was going to meet with them, that getting them together, they would steer me in the right direction. There had to be people working on this, I figured, changing the international law of cannabis, so to speak. No, there wasn't. They looked at me and they said, oh, that's a good idea. Go for it. So now, sort of with a mandate of the cannabis movement, I went to the United Nations in 1998. And that's basically where I became, the activist that I am today, as far as the international end. Like I said, there's other origin stories, because I actually got connected with the Marijuana Policy Project as they were born. And my first year of activism was their first year. If you look at their reports, every report that they submitted that year had my picture in it, give you an idea of how closely we worked together. So yeah, it was a very, very interesting time to be part of such a important and strong cannabis movement that led to the creation of what we now see as our medical cannabis laws, which is such a strong platform on which we are now creating a regulated adult access program, and finally regulated adult legal access at the national level. So yeah, it's interesting just to finish that sort of flow, so you know how that kind of worked. From 1998 to 2008, around there, we worked on badges, entry into the UN, infrastructure, committees within the UN dedicated to our non-government organizations working on drugs, and working on that infrastructure, working on resolutions that helped us establish better communication with the system, all that. And almost seamlessly around 2010 or so, I started working on this next project, which we just succeeded in changing international law just the 2nd of December. That involved about 10 years of work with both the United Nations in Vienna, Austria, and the World Health Organization back in Geneva, Switzerland. And that started with a seed resolution that was put forth by Japan and Azerbaijan in 2009, where they opened Pandora's box of reconsidering cannabis in the treaty. It took about 5 years, behind the scenes, some crazy stuff, but finally led to the World Health Organization doing a full-on review of cannabis. And I could talk more about that, but that review is what led to the recommendations back at the United Nations and a vote and our successful change in treaty. Fascinating road, huh?
Wow, that's incredible. It all started with a spring break trip to Amsterdam. That's amazing. And now here we are a couple of decades later, and we just had this huge victory in the UN. Can you speak a little more about the significance of those UN treaties, those international treaties, and why that's so critical to ending prohibition and increasing access?
Yeah, well, the treaty system is a very interesting one. First of all, it's not a self-executing treaty, the drug control treaty, meaning that you sign it as a country, you obligate yourself as a country to participate in the treaty, but then it's up to you as a country to set up your own laws to actually implement the will of that change. And we did that. We passed the treaty, we signed the treaty, and we joined it in 1961. That's when the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs Treaty was passed. And we signed it in 61. And then actually it's a strange little bit of history that maybe a lot of people didn't quite get to, as far as prehistory of where we are now. It seems to be ancient history almost now, but Timothy Leary, much more well known for his psychedelics work and everything like that, he was actually personally the one who won his case in the Supreme Court back in 1969 against the Marijuana Tax Act. That was the federal law at the time against marijuana. And it was found unconstitutional because you had to incriminate yourself to fill out the tax form. To get a tax stamp, you had to tell them you were breaking the law, which was self-incrimination. It was found to be unconstitutional. It was thrown out. For about a year there, and this is the funny part, I think a lot of people don't know, for about a year there was no federal law. Almost a whole year, there was no federal law against marijuana. It's overshadowed by all the stuff going on in the States, but yeah, there was no federal law at that particular moment. And then the new federal law was passed in 71, the Controlled Substances Act, which very much did implement that treaty and wove the treaty, literally wove it into the law. So if you read the Controlled Substances Act, it actually mentions a treaty, talks about how the treaty is handled, how the law is handled, with respect to the treaty. And of course, that's the United States perspective. Some countries around the world actually have the treaty written into their law to the point where they don't even have their own scheduling at their national level. They just defer to the international scheduling. So the minute the international schedule would be changed, that would change their national law. So, you have to look at each country. There's 186 countries that have signed on to this treaty, 185 plus the United States. The World Health Organization declared back in the 1950s that cannabis wasn't well known as a medicine, didn't have well-known medical uses, and was actually quite dangerous and should be treated with great caution. The way that was interpreted over the years was basically only treat it like a substance for research only drug. And this review, back and forth, very complicated kind of politics, but in the end, the World Health Organization did do an actual full-on formal review where they considered all the research available, all the science available, everything that's known today about cannabis in any capacity, including even seeds. That was what the resolution from Japan was talking about. In the end, they didn't even really talk about seeds, which is funny. Seeds are considered exempt as part of hemp. And the example that they give in the treaty is example of seeds, stems, and stalks, but it literally has parentheses and lists that as a set of examples. The reason why I say that, and emphasize it so much is apparently there's a disagreement there. The body within the United Nations that interprets this stuff is called the International Narcotics Control Board. And their position has been that that's a full list, that that's actually what's exempt is seed, stalks, and stems. But it's ridiculous. Like I said, if you read it, just on its face, reading will be very clear that it's an example of, you know, how hemp is to be treated as exempt under the treaty. So just a side word about this process, the United Nations is separate from the World Health Organization. It's something I didn't know when I started working on this, but they are kind of separate organizations, you know, huge organizations are representing. I think the World Health Organization might even have 1 or 2 countries more in it than the UN, you know. And in the treaty is completely a United Nations thing, but they actually do delegate authority to the World Health Organization to make these scientific evaluations and to recommend placement in these schedules. They created the schedules in the treaty, but the treaty system itself, the UN, really doesn't have the ability to move stuff around in those schedules. It's the World Health Organization has to make that recommendation. Then they can vote it yes or no. It's up to them to actually implement it. So that's that relationship. I just wanted to get that kind of clear. But the World Health Organization reviewed this and came out with 6 recommendations. And only one of them actually was accepted. Oddly enough, the most bold of all the recommendations. The rest of the recommendations could almost be seen as housekeeping, you know, correcting sort of unscientific, you know, placement. But the one bold change was removal of cannabis and cannabis resin from Schedule 4 in the treaty. The way the New York Times reported on it was cannabis removed from the most dangerous drugs category. And that's a good way to describe it, because that was how heroin was, you know, scheduled. It was right there in the same way that heroin was scheduled. And now it's no longer scheduled in the same way that heroin is scheduled. And the World Health Organization has changed its position. That 1950s position is now gone, and their current position is that cannabis has well-known medical value and that it can be used with well-tolerated side effects that are, you know, not negative enough to warrant any kind of special warnings. And in fact, they even recommended placement for some cannabis products that were harder to abuse. Think like cannabis cough syrup, for example. They recommended over-the-counter sales for that. But again, the UN didn't accept that. There's a thing, I won't go into all the different recommendations. It's just too much nuance really to run through without slides to get your brain around. But the thing is this, there were 2 situations that the WHO tried to correct that we as cannabis consumers, industry, cannabis movement, all would agree with. And one is that THC right now is scheduled and placed in such a way as to give an edge to non-plant-based THC. Non-plant-based synthetic, pure synthetic THC actually has an easier time going through the regulatory process. It's more easily available to the patient than the plant-based alternative. And that's just ridiculous. The World Health Organization sought to fix that. It got rebuffed. And CBD. Another situation where right now there's a debate as to whether CBD drawn from hemp sold as a food or, you know, starting to edge closer and closer to medicine, how to treat that, if it's still exempt as hemp or should be considered a marijuana extract and therefore controlled, right? Could be looked at both ways, but synthetic, pure synthetic CBD, not from plant material, not controlled at all. There's it's not anywhere. It's just absolutely uncontrolled. So you can go down to the gas station and get pure synthetic, not from plant CBD, and it's absolutely legal. But yet, you know, the pharmacy is having trouble delivering the plant material. Yeah, not right. So I think that the World Health Organization tried to, you know, do a good job. I think they came up with recommendations that were doable, and we did them. So one last little note, when the United Nations does anything in this drug control program over in Vienna, they have to have a consensus, 100% consensus. One country objects, it's shot down. So that seed resolution, for example, was a consensus resolution passed over to the WHO. The vote on whether to accept the WHO recommendations is just a simple majority vote. So that was a lot easier for us to win than trying to get every single country in line. The drug control program is run by a commission of 53 countries that are delegated the authority by the 186 countries that have signed the treaty, that 53 countries are delegated the authority to do those day-to-day changes on a year-to-year basis. And it took 2 years of their work to go through these recommendations, 2 years of the WHO to do the studies and everything, and then 2 years at the United Nations to finally, and a whole year of politicking and work to get it all started. It's a 5-year process, basically started 2015, ended 2020 with the successful vote. And it really, in my mind, hasn't ended yet, because to me, it'll really end when that notification is sent out from the United Nations to all the countries saying that the UN has changed the international drug law. And that's when it gets interesting and back in the US, if you want to talk about what's likely to happen here about that.
Yeah, let's go for it. What's likely to happen here?
Yeah, so we, as I said, we are tied into this treaty. The way it's written into our law is, and this is interesting, that is something I just found out fairly recently myself. Again, we've been, as activists in the cannabis movement, I've been working for like 50 years to fight the scheduling of cannabis, to remove cannabis out of Schedule I in the United States, where it's literally written in the law that it has no medical value and it should be prohibited. The active ingredient of marijuana, THC, cannabis is active ingredient in a pill, again, synthetic, but in a sesame seed oil capsule, was approved by the FDA and put in Schedule II. And then that was down scheduled to Schedule III because it was so safe. And we still have the plant material in Schedule I as the most dangerous drug not available. That's the disparity that we're in right now in the US. And we've been fighting that in court for like 50 years under this section of code in the Controlled Substances Act that pertains to those schedules. Well, check this out. If you read past those paragraphs to the next paragraph in our Controlled Substances Act, it gets to the treaty clause, what I'll call the treaty clause, but it literally mentions treaty obligations and whatnot. And the first part of that says that the Attorney General shall disregard the previous section, the one we've been fighting it for 50 years. This is the first sentence in the next section. The Attorney General will disregard that previous section and will place cannabis in the schedule, or any drug in the schedule appropriate to the changes in the Drug Control Treaty. So in other words, the Drug Control Treaty that we've signed into may specify a certain level of control. That level of control is then interpreted, because the numbers don't add up at all, and it does take, at the minimum, some interpretation. But then that's interpreted by supposedly our Attorney General, according to law. Attorney General has, for the most part, delegated that authority to the DEA, but it's not clear that this change from the treaty down will be delegated to the DEA. My opinion is that it probably won't. Going from us up, in other words, when we're challenging the scheduling, we had to deal with the DEA. That was who was delegated the authority to fight with us. But I don't know that this change in the treaty is actually going to ever hit the DEA first. It'll probably hit the Justice Department through the State Department, top down. And the Attorney General then, according to that section, will make a determination of what schedule is appropriate in our law, and that's what stands, disregarding the previous section. So we just knocked down that whole myth of cannabis being dangerous and should be scheduled like heroin. It no longer applies at all. It shouldn't even be scheduled like morphine or anything like that, really. That was how it was already scheduled, essentially. The Justice Department was saying that we could have Schedule I or II. That's what they said years ago. That was our limit under what the treaty said before. So I think that's our starting point. It has to be at least less restrictive than Schedule II, which would put it at least on par with its active ingredient drug, Marinol, which is a good start. So I think that's what's likely to happen. That's the debate. I can almost see it now. The DEA is going to be debating on the side of staying in I or II, and then we're going to be debating on the other side, saying that's what we had already. What's the change then, right? And the changes, I think 3, 4, or 5 should be open to us, and it would be up to the executive branch. In other words, our new president, as of noon today, will have the option of more options based on this change as soon as they get the letter in their hand from the United Nations that says that the international law has been changed.
So do you think that it's likely that that's going to happen? Like, do you think that the Biden administration will actually move on it?
The question for me has been really around the Senate seats, because the 2 Senate seats that were in Georgia, if they had gone to where they seem to be going, to the Republican Party, then you'd have that Republican controlled Senate and Democratic controlled House, and you weren't seeing any movement on bills, no hearings really in the Senate. We had a historic House passage of the MORE Act. That's a Senate bill. We haven't even gotten the vote, in the Senate because of that blockade. So now that those 2 Senate seats actually went to the Democrats, and there'll at least be hearings on that MORE Act in the Senate, but it's still very tight. It's a 50-50 split. It would be hard to imagine a controversial bill like that actually passing out, at least not quickly. There'll be certainly some debate, some time on that. And in the meantime, there's going to be an urge to move quickly. And I think this may just, I haven't been able to have the proper conversation with the incoming administration to really give you insight into this. And I hope to have that soon. And I hope to avail the system actually to our expertise of our team in what we've done. This connection really hasn't been made yet. However, the words that I've gotten already, hearing from incoming President Biden was already talking about scheduling as an option. He was already talking about rescheduling to Schedule 2 as part of that ceiling that I was talking about before. I think that would have been a natural option. If he's at all thinking about that, and if they're at all paying attention to the what's their job, the executive branch's job to keep this conversation going in Vienna, and to work on these treaties day to day. The Senate can pass a law, and this is an interesting thing I also learned pretty recently. The Senate can pass a law like the MORE Act that basically just ignores the treaty and legalizes marijuana, creates national regulated adult access, even though that really should require addressing the treaty and addressing the language of the treaty. At the very least, trying to change the treaty. At the very least, us presenting our case for why the treaty should be changed. And at the very least, us formally, at least withdrawing from the treaty, or formally addressing that disparity, with some kind of process that we would undertake. So that really hasn't been talked of at all yet. It's something that would be really good, but it's not really absolutely necessary, is my point. That the MORE Act, any law of Congress, from what I've been taught about case law, the Congress can actually pass a law, flies right in the face of our treaty commitments, and that's okay. It's not unconstitutional to do that. So that presents some very interesting questions, lots and lots of very interesting questions as we move forward. But our advice, actually, we talked to attorneys and looked at it really closely, and our advice is really low hanging. While all we advise on the MORE Act is a note be inserted around that treaty clause, because the treaty clause doesn't specifically say marijuana. It just says drugs that are controlled under the treaty. So if they put an explanatory note with a little star, so you go down, it says, on such and such a day, we change the law so this treaty clause doesn't affect marijuana anymore. It doesn't affect cannabis. That would be all they'd have to do, and it would make it clear. My fear is that in the future, this is going to be kind of cryptic to understand what we just did if they don't do that.
Michael, let me ask you to let's shift gears for a moment from the policy side of things to the business side of things, which are quite intertwined. I'm curious, from your perspective, having been doing this work for many years now and seeing the legal industry really be born, how do you feel about the way things have progressed? And I'll preface, the question a bit with, I know a lot of activists who are pretty disgruntled with industry and how things are going and how it's been built and so on and so forth. And so I'm curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, I would describe our point in history as a point of discontinuity. If you remember mathematics, the graph, there's a nice smooth graph, but if there's a point of discontinuity, it just jumps. At that point, it's almost in two places at once, it looks like almost, and then it moves on. And you have almost two realities. You have the reality on the left, you have the reality on the right, and the reality in between is I don't know, somewhere in mathematical hell. That's where we are right now. We're in the middle of that mathematical hell. What can I say? I have a vision of the future that's pretty clear, and unfortunately, a vision of the past that's very clear. But how we get there is the key, the trick. I think that folks that are basing their models on prohibition numbers need to reassess their math and think more clearly about the future. I think that one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is indoor versus outdoor. Indoor has been fundamentally a function of prohibition, where you need to hide the crop from the helicopters. You need to hide it even from the electric company. I mean, you have to hide it in a basement with your own generator, and seed sales have been something that we've spread around the world openly without any recognition of source. We would never do that for like any other kind of produce. You don't get Guatemalan pumpkins and not have some kind of connection to Guatemala in the end, but we did that. And now we have to just sort of move on and create something new. In other words, the thing we're creating now is not going to be based on what we had in the past. It's not even a projection of what we had in the past. It's a different reality that we're creating now, where we respect origin, we respect people's intellectual property, we respect their genetic source material, we respect their history, their knowledge of their traditional uses and medicines. We respect all those things that were totally disrespected during the drug war. And then finally, we have a plant that is being treated as an agricultural crop when it's hemp, up to, in the US, up to 3%, 0.3% THC. Is I'd love it was 3%. That should be the change now, but yeah, I think it's 0.3% THC. And then above that is considered marijuana, which is grown only under state laws, but that's irrelevant to my conversation right now. It's grown as a drug crop. It's grown under alcohol control. It's grown under drug control. It's grown under medicine control, whatever. In various states, it's different ways, but none of it basically is agricultural. And that's where we're going to be eventually, is that there's one agricultural crop. It just doesn't make sense to have a line in the sand based on THC value. What happens when you collect 300 acres of the THC from the 0.1% THC crop? You still get 3 55-gallon drums of THC. It's the same 55-gallon drum of THC. That's the 55-gallon drum problem they're dealing with right now. And then, we have individuals that I like to think about famous Amos cookies. And in Virginia, the way we've been presenting it is, home cultivation is the first rung of our commercial ladder. It's the non-commercial rung of our commercial ladder. You grow at home, you share with your friends. If you can do it well enough, you can produce a cookie good enough, maybe you go to that first rung after that and get a license and get into the industry. What that does is it gives a huge genetic resource to the industry of diversity that's unimaginable under a corporate model, because you have individual sort of like crowdsource ability to do this. And I think that industry needs to embrace these things and understand that it's not competition, that it's part of a different way of doing things in the future. And, if you're basing things again on a prohibition model of $15 or $20 a gram, consider that out there somewhere is someone working on a formula for Petri dish THC,
Yeah, so just to echo a little of what you're saying, what I'm hearing is this, this corporate model is really still, in a lot of places, the way it's being regulated is built on scarcity and artificial scarcity, in fact, where they limit licenses and say only, these people can produce and these people can sell and, so forth, when really that's like the antithesis of cannabis, where this is a natural resource, a sustainable, renewable resource with so much value, so much utility to offer in so many different ways. And to your point, if we instead encouraged everyone who wanted to be involved and to actually, take that non-commercial rung of the ladder seriously as an important base and an important part of the foundation, we would all be so much better off in the long term, because, just like on the scientific side where we're basically, prevented from doing research on humans and all of this stuff that's holding us back, it's the same way where if we could we'd be able to throw fuel on the fire and accelerate innovation and data and good information. And instead, we have to fight for every inch, it seems like.
That's it.
Michael, let me ask you, and I swear I'm not asking this because I need to know the answer. I'm asking for the audience, but how have you been able to sustain and persist in this mission for so many years without getting discouraged, disgruntled, giving up, or any of that stuff? And I promise I'm not asking because the thoughts ever crossed my mind, certainly.
Yeah, well, there's another origin story, and that is, as I said, there's several. And this one is my wife saying, quit complaining about it and do something already. And, I'm a disabled vet. I would be sitting on my couch a lot, probably spending money on eBay or something. This gives me something else to do and keeps me out of my wife's hair. The work that we've done has really been, if you're looking at it very slow, if you're looking at it day by day, you can get incredibly, you can get incredibly discouraged, unfortunately. And there's certain places, where you can look and be incredibly discouraged, places geographically, but also places as in, areas of policy, areas of blind spots of our movement, et cetera. But if you look at the big picture, like at the United Nations, for example, that when I came in 1998, they were just grappling with demand reduction versus supply reduction. Seriously, they had supply reduction they did in their last treaty discussions that they had in the 1980s. They kind of got that around, in their brain, but then they were looking at demand reduction. And then in the 90s, we as a non-governmental world, non-governmental organizations really pioneered harm reduction. And, countries like the Netherlands helped lead the way as countries, but it was mostly grassroots effort, needle exchange thing, very low level grassroots efforts to save lives that created the understanding of harm reduction as we know it, non-judgmental, meeting the drug user where they are to improve their lives stuff, rather than just say no, improving their lives by abstinence. It's a very different fork in the road. And it took about 10 years and the United Nations got their brain around that. So really now, honestly, in the 2000s, the UN actually has its brain around harm reduction, but we're already, where were we? We're out there way ahead of that in finally getting rid of the last vestiges of the worst aspects of prohibition by creating regulated access, by getting rid of prohibition, the final, stamping out the cockroaches of our ancestors' ideas about prohibition, which are just faulty, very, very faulty. And that's our fight. This is our fight right now. I wish I could have done this 20, 30 years ago when I had more energy. That's about the only thing I wish, because this is really exciting. This 10 years in the United Nations, this 10 years inside the United States, this 10 years internationally of the cannabis industry being born, essentially, internationally, taking that step, first baby step from little small medicinal access programs, sharing a little bit of cannabis back and forth, to actually full on industry of adult regulated access is going to be really something to see. And if working on the local level policy is any, guide, is any model, we have some complexity, we have some real work to do. Everybody that has been working on this so long has a job to do now, more than we would have expected, a lot more than we would have actually anticipated, but a lot more fun too. And this is, come on, I attended a hearing today in Virginia where nobody talked about, it was a legalization, how to legalize cannabis in Virginia. They're implementing it. There's a bill on the floor ready to go, and no arguments against it, no arguments in favor of it or against it. It's all nuance of how do we do this right. We've gotten past in just like 1 year, I don't even know when it happened or where, but in the last year or two, that whole notion of defending this idea of decriminalization, defending the idea of legalization, we don't even do that anymore. Now it's nuance, roll up your sleeves to get it right. And don't count on industry to do it all. Industry is spending a lot of money. They got a lot of lobbyists. They're doing a lot of good work. Unfortunately, they piss off a lot of grassroots activists because they reinvent the wheel a lot, and they have to train their lobbyists to do what we're already doing in many cases. That's growing pains, I'd call that. But unfortunately, they don't see all the perspectives that we would see as citizens. there are some missing points of view, like home cultivation, for example, that, like poor and veterans access, folks that don't have insurance coverage, aren't wealthy enough to purchase cannabis, et cetera. These are all issues that seem to fall on society at large to solve with industry's help, but not necessarily driven by industry. But I see that as a partnership moving forward. And I just want people to, have my perspective of where we fit into that, not to give up and go home, but rather to sort of become more specialized.
As far as in the UN, when it comes to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, how common or not is it to hear hemp in those conversations? And, I ask because in my opinion, hemp is this miraculous plant that can address so many of the SDGs. And yet, from what I've seen, the ESG world, the impact investment world, and a lot of the sustainability world has been really slow to embrace and champion hemp. And I'm wondering if that's consistent with what your experience has been, what you've seen, or if that's changing. And can you speak to that a bit?
I'm glad you brought that up. I had thought in my mind a few minutes ago, oh, it's a shame we talked for so long and never got to SDGs, because it really is a fundamental part of our work that we've done over the last few years. Another organization I didn't mention before, FAAT, FAAAT, 3 A's, FAAT, Foundation for Alternative Approaches for Addiction Treatment, Think and Do Tank out of Paris, France. And my partner in Barcelona, Spain, Kenzie Ribules, came to me basically through that FAAT project. Farid Guillouchet in Paris. The three of us sort of make up that core team that have led a lot of this effort in Geneva, and have worked on this, inside the United Nations. And what we decided to do, it was right about where we wanted to put a bunch of people into the process in Vienna, so that they can understand what was going on around the World Health Organization recommendations. Like I said, there was a lot of drama, I talked about before, back and forth, crazy stuff. I didn't want to get into the great depth, because each one of those things could be a whole other story and show about the shenanigans going on, and the obstinate objections from Russia and Nigeria, and the battle on the floor, and it's such a saga, so much drama. But at the end of the day, the process is sort of invisible, not even like transparently, like invisible, like cut off completely from view from the world, because inside the United Nations, there's very few media that go in there and cover it at all. They do occasionally come in if there's a world leader that comes in and speaks on the podium or something, says a really great speech. As usual, they come in with all their press and they cover that, and they basically leave. And 90%, 95% of what goes on there is never covered. And even our cannabis activist community doesn't know really what's going on. So our idea was, hey, what we'll do, this Sustainable Development Goal program was starting. It's a 2020 to 2030 agenda, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal agenda, 17 development goals to try to change our world for the better. What I would call good metrics of success. Instead of like at the drug control program, they'll come in and just say, oh, we arrested more people than last year, we eradicated more plants than last year. Boy, that's success. No, success is like the SDGs. Did it make me feel safer? Did it make me feel less poor? Did it give me a job? Did it, put food on the table? Is it protecting the environment? These are things I can put my teeth into. I like that. So it was a win-win for us. We decided to have a conference. We brought together a conference. Some activists that we're working with in Vienna had a heart set on putting a conference in this big Vienna, Austria center that's physically located like right next to the United Nations. And we did it. Somehow we pulled it off. We put on a real for real, international, high quality, business style conference surrounding the Sustainable Development Goals. And we came up with a book that was the product of that meeting and of the consultations leading up to that meeting. And the idea was simple. They're doing these Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of it has to do with, criminal justice. A lot of it has to do with protecting the environment. A lot of things that we pride ourselves very deeply in the cannabis movement for. and really have never really addressed or spoken to much at all. We've crossed over a little bit over the years with environmental groups and things like that on particular issues, human rights groups on particular issues. But this is a chance for us to really put forth our ideas of how we can meet each and every one of these goals, if applicable. And it wound up being like 2 or 3 of the goals we had nothing to say about. Like 14 others we had a lot to say about. And we pulled this conference together and brought people in, and actually brought 50 of those people with badges into the United Nations to watch the World Health Organization deliver its recommendations. And they didn't. They dropped the mic and they delayed. It was part of that drama I was talking about. So it wound up being a good point of reflection and a moment on the historical curve that I'm pretty proud of. But we were pretty bummed at that moment. But nonetheless, that was the idea. And we came up with this book. You can find it on the web, and certainly go to the FAT websites. It's still up and you can find it. The Cannabis and Sustainable Development is the title. And it goes through the various sustainable development goals and how the cannabis world, yeah, there you go. That's it. That's the one. So it's a good primer and a good starting point for a conversation that really carries through all this whole decade. Again, this is a really neat decade to be working on this stuff.
Awesome. Michael, let's do a quick bit of coaching, and I'm going to ask you to be the coach. And what I mean by that is, a big part of coaching is having to tell people the things that they might not want to hear and that most people are reluctant to tell them. And so we chatted a bit earlier about there's some things that the business community, the cannabis business community, doesn't want to hear, but probably needs to hear. And so I'm wondering if you have anything that you can share.
Well, the pet issue, I think, for me these days in the last few years has been the ability for people to be able to grow at home. And we talked about that. The first rung of that ladder. I think that is a knee-jerk reaction to fight against home grow. I mean, there was industry pushback in New York very recently, historically pushing back against people being able to grow their own, with the idea that you'll pay more money into the system, pay the taxes, and the tax model will work, everything. I get it. I get what they're trying to do, and I get what they're thinking, but it is incorrect to think that the individual home grower is somehow an opponent or an obstacle to be gotten rid of for an effective regulated system. It just doesn't seem to work that way. People can cultivate their own and share it with their friends, and more often than not, just as it is with home brewing beer, or for that matter, taking a fish out of the pond behind your house, you wind up going down to the pet store and spending $300 on fish tanks and air pumps and rocks and gravel, and it works out. It works out in the end, and I think it's really important for medicinal access to survive this time period. I think giving back directly from industry to help people that are poor, people that are homeless, access cannabis. I think these are all programs that, although they may seem on their face to be a tax burden, we had that pushback from California's governor when we tried to create our charity program to allow for tax write-off, so you can give cannabis from the dispensary system that's, let's say, outdated or off the shelf or going off the shelf. You want to donate it to the veterans, or you want to donate it to people that are unable to pay the prices of the cannabis, and they weren't able to do it without actually having to pay the taxes, the full tax bill. And the governor pushed back, saying that wasn't the will of the people, that the will of the people was to pay the taxes. And, I think these things are so, it reminds me of Kevin Sabet and the opposition to cannabis. And they were railing against something we put in Nevada, which was something that we put in as an accommodation to them, where you couldn't grow your own if you lived near a dispensary. That was an accommodation to them. And yet they used it against us, saying that, oh, look, they won't let you grow your own if you live in a dispensary because they want to support big business and big tobacco. And oh my God, my brain wants to explode. It's not true. That's not it. It's not Kevin Sabet's perspective. It's not the industry perspective. It's not, all these perspectives seem askew. Yeah, you should be able to grow your own no matter where you are. That's our position. And if we made an accommodation to get something on the books, those accommodations should start wearing out now. We don't need to be making accommodations anymore. So hopefully those kind of errors will disappear. But yeah, I think we all should be working together. Unlike Kevin Sabet, I'm not against big industry. I am in favor of fairness and for the little guy. When Kevin Sabet comes in and complains of blue streak and causes legislators to create a whole bunch more careful regulation and careful rules, every one of those new regulations creates a burden for a small business to have more legal infrastructure to be able to deal with that, and naturally favors big industry, big business, which is Kevin Sabet's stated opponent, the big corporate tobacco model. That's what he fights against, which again, I think our cannabis movement really doesn't really like the big corporate tobacco model either. So we should be all in consensus working forward here. And I'll work with big tobacco. I'm not against big tobacco, but again, we shouldn't be giving them an unfair edge. They shouldn't have the ability to do what an individual can't do.
So Michael, let me ask you one last question before I let you go, which is, what advice do you have for veterans or even civilians who want to get involved in the movement, in the advocacy for greater access to cannabis?
Be creative. Be creative. This is a point for creativity. Don't try to fit into the cookie cutter that you see in front of you, because as I've been kind of alluding to, we're at a point where we're going to have to imagine something new. I'm a historian. I've worked a lot on, it's another whole show we can do just talking about artifacts and the cannabis history. But in short, we've never done this before. Cannabis was legal up until it was made illegal. So it was never illegal, but it was never a regulated industry. We had regulated medicinal access in some places, but we never had a regulated industry for non-medical use. You just buy it out of magazines. It was unregulated. May have been tariffs on imported goods, but it wasn't any kind of special regulation for cannabis. And not, I think, to be fair, especially with what we know about cannabis and how we're dissecting it into cannabinoids and coming up with different preparations that some of them may be more abusable and less abusable than others, I think it actually does bode well to have a careful regulation for cannabis that is different than other agricultural, products, and different from alcohol for that matter. But this is new. This is a whole new paradigm that we're creating that isn't really based on anything in the past. And for that reason, I would urge people to be creative in what they do and think, and try to protect the specialness of this plant person relationship as we try to put it into a sort of a bag, with a UPC code. There's a transition we need to make where somehow we need to cherish and preserve that Chinese apothecary with hundreds of drawers and somebody behind the counter that knows what's in every one of those drawers, where it came from, the farmers, how they grew it. There's a special relationship there, and then somehow get that and the essence of the best of that into commercial products, because recognizing that most people are going to buy the Budweiser beer, not spend $25 for a craft 6-pack, and most people are going to buy a bottle of wine for $5 or $6 from the grocery store, not spend $100 on the fanciest wine. I'm betting that there'll be quite a few people that want that $100 bottle of wine, and that's where I'm aiming. My vision is on the future where the best cannabis will be still available and will sort of have that specialty niche. But the Budweiser of cannabis is going to be very different than anything you're looking at now. So if you're planning on working in that world, look at the future with a lens that doesn't involve recreating the past.
I love that. Michael, thank you so very much for spending the afternoon with me here chatting about all of this stuff. I'm sure we could do several more hours of this because you've got so much great stuff and amazing stories to share. So I want to thank you for your time, and also thank you for all the work you've done for these many, many years. And I hope that you just keep on fighting the good fight and leading the way to greater cannabis access for all of us. So thank you.
Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is the cannabis business coach. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is. Hi, Mike Z is
the cannabis business coach.